Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome once again to the SportsPro Podcast. My name is Eoin Connolly. I'm the editor-at-large at SportsPro. I hope you're all very well. Guest today, very happy to have with me SportsPro editorial director Michael Long. Hi Mike.
Hello Eoin, how are you?
I'm not too bad, Mike. How are you?
Yeah, very well indeed.
And also joining us for the first time, BBC 5 Live tennis commentator and co-host of the Tennis Podcast, David Law. Hi, David.
Hi there. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks, David. How are you?
Yeah, very well. It's a strange old time for us all, and the sport of tennis has not been immune to that either. But it continues on, and it's very nice to talk to you.
Yeah, great to have you on. Obviously, for the benefit of listeners who haven't put two and two together, we are talking today about the business of tennis. Strange week, particularly here in the UK, to be doing so because we are entering the week of what is the final appearance of the ATP Finals in London. But none of us are there. And in another year, the three of us might have all met up there and done this in person and been among the tens of thousands of people trickling in and out of the O2 down in southeast London. That's not happening because it is very, very different environment. Obviously, it's still taking place, but with no fans and with very, very limited media. So it's a different spectacle. The same 8 leading men's players, but certainly not the same tournament. And a strange note for it to go out on. We're going to be talking generally today about the business of tennis in 2020, but I think the ATP Finals is probably a good jumping off point. It's just over a decade, David, since it debuted at the O2. It will be heading off to Turin for 2021. What has this done? I mean, obviously it's coincided with this extraordinary era for talent in the men's game. But what's this done for the profile of the sport in this country? What's this done for the profile of the ATP, do you think?
Well, I think it's brought to the fore for a British audience that tennis doesn't just happen in the summer. I think it is one of the most responsible events and initiatives that has given the British sports fan and the general punter, frankly, knowledge that tennis goes on 12 months a year. And it's an event that is actually in its 50th year in total. If you go back to all the years that it spent in New York at Madison Square Garden, and it moved to Germany and it went around the world, and then it set up home at the O2 Arena in 2009. I remember going to what was the original Millennium Dome when it was first opened, and I remember standing inside there and thinking, imagine if this was an indoor sports facility. I mean, I know that sound like I'm trying to say, oh, I thought of this ahead of time. That's not what I'm trying to do, but I always did think that it had that potential, but I couldn't have imagined that it would lead to what it did and that it would actually end up happening. But as a tennis venue, as an indoor tennis venue, it is just about perfect. 17,000 seats that they managed to make usable. And I think what they did really impressively was just create a feel, a brand of its own. And the main person responsible for that initially from an organisation standpoint was Chris Kermode, who used to be the Queen's tournament director. He came along as the managing director of this new project, the ATP Finals at the O2. And he had the idea that if you tried to give it a sort of concert feel or a big title fight in boxing feel of having the court illuminated and the crowd in darkness, that you would have something that just isn't something you see anywhere else in the world in tennis. And that's what happened. I think the other thing he managed to do is realize that there was a big enough market to have 2 sessions per day, one in the afternoon, one in the evening, 2 completely separate numbers of people, 17,000 in each. And so we got to a point where the tournament over its 8 days was getting towards 250,000 people through the doors every single year. So that's an incredible legacy that it created. I think that there were some players who decided that they would like to see it move after maybe 7 or 8 years, not because it wasn't an enormous success, but just because they felt it should be moving around the world to spread the word about the sport of tennis. But in terms of its sheer success, it's up there with Madison Square Garden in what it leaves as a legacy. And it's a terrible shame, like so many things are a terrible shame, that it's going to come to an end with hardly anybody in the stadium because the doors are closed.
Yeah, I mean that obviously creates problems, or it's indicative of problems elsewhere in the sport in 2020, Mike. But just to stay on the legacy of the ATP Finals, obviously it's very much bound up in that of Chris Kermode, as well as David says. What do you think has happened to the ATP in that time? You've been following that story very closely, and you've also obviously been to the ATP Finals a few times over the past decade as well.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. I think, as everyone knows, as David was saying, huge commercial success. For the ATP itself, this is a massive revenue generator for them, this particular tournament. So a huge factor, I imagine, in staying in London for so long was obviously what it does for the ATP's business. I think as the ATP has evolved over in recent years, I'm sure David can speak to this in some more depth, but obviously, as you alluded to at the beginning, this has been a golden era for tennis, for men's tennis. This past decade, we've had Andy Murray's success, particularly within the UK, and what he's done for British tennis more generally, and the Davis Cup and in Wimbledon. And so the ATP have really been able to kind of ride the wave of interest that has come off the back of that. In terms of this event in particular, it's really a destination kind of showpiece occasion for them. Caps off the year in spectacular fashion. You go to the event, you feel like it's a nice blend of kind of hardcore tennis aficionados, and then obviously a lot of tourists who come along for the occasion, for the big names on show and the spectacle itself. Funnily enough, I think last year's finals were possibly, if I remember correctly, maybe there was a Six Nations match thrown in there back in February, but I think it was the last event I attended in the flesh. So it's strange to sit here a year on. But during that event, I sat down with Chris Kermode and obviously reflected on his 6 years at the helm. He's very proud of what he did personally for this tournament and the ATP more generally. His legacy is bundled within the legacy of the tournament itself and what it leaves behind in London. Be interesting to see what the ATP does from here, though. I think for all the success that we've seen in of the tournament in London, moving to Turin next year, can you foresee this tournament staying on another decade in another city? Probably not. Who knows? It'd be interesting to see. It's such a tough act to follow. So it would be something that we'll have to watch closely, and hopefully everything will be back to normal, and everyone will be able to attend that event next year. We'd like to think. So it's been a huge piece of the ATP's growth, and I think obviously the star draws within the game itself have drawn a lot of people to this particular tournament. I think it is the largest indoor tennis tournament in the world, and as David said, it just has brought another dynamic or another element to men's tennis.
Yeah, I think it was an interesting point that David made about the splitting into sessions, so it attracts a different kind of spectator. It creates a different kind of experience. It's that thing of you create an activity that kind of fits in the same slot as going to the theatre or going to the cinema or what other whatever other stuff you might be up to in that early winter time of the year. It will be interesting, David, to see what happens with Turin. Obviously, the ATP now has taken on a slightly more Italian identity with Andrea Gaudenzi, although he's based here. Obviously, is an Italian. We have the ATP Next Gen Finals in Italy as well, in Milan, and as they have been since 2017, although they unfortunately weren't able to happen this year. Do you think there's an appetite for a longer stay somewhere else, or do you think this is, as Mike kind of hinted at there, now an opportunity for the ATP to start thinking a bit more globally about how it puts these events on?
I'm not exactly sure what their strategy is from here, but I think that certainly in the short term they will give Turin a proper go, and actually it's the perfect time to be doing this really from their perspective, in as much as Italian tennis is absolutely thriving. And one of the things Chris Commode always talked about was that he would, and he's not there anymore, he's not the ATP CEO anymore, but he always felt that he would much rather stay in London and have the crowd and have this fantastic appetite for the sport and this atmosphere, rather than taking what might have been more money to move it to the Middle East or to China and not have that sort of atmosphere. I do think there is potential in Turin to have that atmosphere. And one of the reasons for that is they just have so many players coming through. It's never been in a better state, quite honestly, Italian tennis, both men and women. And in a young guy called Yannick Sinner, who's only about 20 years of age, he's on a trajectory where in the next 2 years, if not next year, and it's possible next year, he might even be amongst this group of players. But in the next couple of years, you would certainly expect that he might well be able to appear at this tournament. And he was part of the Next Gen finals in Milan last year, and the atmosphere was great. It was really good. I would say at the O2, there were just the last couple of years, maybe we've just become a little bit fatigued by it to some degree. Maybe that's more just us in the media, that we've taken it for granted, to be quite honest. And this year, for instance, has been a bit of a wake-up call to us all. But that hasn't really fed through into the crowd response. I mean, anytime you don't have Andy Murray or Roger Federer in the field, you will feel it in terms of interest levels. But for many, many years, we were seeing matches between not particularly big star names with players that were in the rest of the group, whether it's Marin Cilic or Thomas Berdych or David Ferrer. And yet people had bought the ticket for the session to go and see the tennis. Whoever's on is on. And they would turn out, and it was the same for the doubles players. They play the top 8 doubles teams as well. And they'd play one doubles match and one singles match in the afternoon, and the same again in the evening. And people would come and they would sit through effectively the appetizer of the doubles, and they were invested, and there was a big crowd. This was the biggest crowd that the doubles teams played in front of all year long. And I think that was one of its greatest successes in London. And I do think in Turin that they've got a decent chance of having that atmosphere. And that really is, I think, vital.
Well, I mean, I want to talk a bit later about what the future of the ATP might be, what the future as well of WTA and other parts of the game might be, because there is a new leadership for the ATP with Andrea Gaudenzi and Massimo Calvelli, who've kind of, between the two of them, are replacing Chris Kermode. You know, obviously, it is a different event this year for very straightforward reasons, which is the same as everything else is so different. What, David, have been the things that the COVID-19 pandemic, the interruptions to the calendar, the withdrawal of fans from almost every event, what has that thrown up about the sport and the state that the sport is in, and maybe some of the vulnerabilities of professional tennis?
It's a very robust sport in terms of its social and micro ability to be played, in that you are naturally socially distanced by standing across a net from one another. But internationally and as a professional sport, it is hugely challenged because of the amount of travel involved. This is not a sport that is easily sectioned off into regions the way that football can carry on, because the Premier League and the Championship are all played in the same country. We've seen it in Australia as well, the local leagues. We're seeing players travelling from all over the globe to a location, and for instance, the US Open, they managed to create the bubble so that they could play within that. And then a week later, they were expected all to go to Rome and do the same again, and then to Paris. And that does create enormous logistical challenges. And if we look back to March, when the pandemic first really hit, I remember hearing just rumours that Indian Wells, was the big tournament in California in March, was was nervous about the number of cases they were hearing and moving around, but they hadn't had any confirmed cases in California at that time. They had one single case in the Coachella Valley in California, and they cancelled the tournament completely. And they'd already got all of the players over there, but they cancelled it, and those players had to come home. And from then, it was like dominoes going down. In terms of the tournaments, they all got cancelled. Miami, Monte Carlo, the whole clay court season, the French Open just relocated itself to a different part of the calendar in October in the hope that it could be played, and of course it was. Wimbledon was cancelled for the first time since World War II. Queen's, the tournament that I work at as well as doing my commentary work. I'm the media director there, and I've been working there for 25 years, and it's always been there. It's been a constant, and so there was no tennis. There were no tournaments for players to play. These are independent freelancers who, if there isn't tennis, they don't earn money. So for the very rich players, that's not a problem, but there are many players that are just struggling to get by. And if you look throughout the industry, and I'm sure this is the same in all sports to a lesser or greater degree, there are just knock-on effects everywhere. All of my freelance broadcast colleagues, for instance, or journalists who rely on the sport to exist in order to earn money, there was nothing for them to cover. The hospitality industry within the sport, it just sucked everything out of it, to be quite honest. And then it was a case of, Wimbledon obviously did a fantastic job in that they had pandemic insurance, which is they're the only ones in the world in tennis, to my knowledge, that had this, which covered them to a large degree, or at least to an important degree. They're about to get a very hefty payout at the end of this year. But the rest of the tour, even with no fans, the view was, well, we have to try to make this viable, both as a tour in order to give players jobs and for tournaments to be able to survive. And the only way they can survive is to run themselves and to keep those TV rights that they've sold. For instance, the US Open had to go ahead so that it could get ESPN's money. And that's what it managed to do by creating a bubble. And it was touch and go. It really was touch and go as to whether it would be able to be played at all. But they've learned how to live with the virus in terms of creating bubbles, testing, having no fans, and they're just trying to get through this period.
Yeah, the kind of crisscrossing freelance nature of it, Mike, has been highlighted this morning. This report from Stuart Fraser in the Times about just how complex it's going to be to get the Australian Open on. Even though we're a few weeks out, there are players who are still not sure where they can get flights from, and there's confusion over how extensive the quarantine has to be. It's a 2-week quarantine at the moment for arrivals into Australia. So does that mean players have to be thinking about traveling, before the new year and hunkering down? And does that mean that their staff are going to have to do the same? And obviously, as David says, there are players who are very wealthy who are not going to go hungry from a few months of slightly lower activity, but that is definitely not the case for everybody on these tours.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's a logistical nightmare, isn't it? And there's so much uncertainty still swirling as we head into next year around hosting major events and cross-border travel and all of the restrictions that come with it, quarantines and things like that. They're just going to cause real headaches for tournament directors and organisers, aren't they? For some time yet. Tennis isn't unique in that sense. You see Formula One and how it kind of gravitated towards Europe this year, just trying to contain the amount of travel required and the logistical challenges of that. But yeah, you're right. I think across all sports, it's I think the smaller tournaments, the lower ranked players, the arena workers, the freelance journalists, it's disproportionately impacted the kind of lower ends of the sport. And as you say, there are those top players who will be able to kind of withstand a knock like this. But it'd be interesting to see, who has been hit hardest, how things play out heading into next year. Question for you, David, would be: do you think has this now focused minds, this pandemic, on resetting the economics of tennis. We saw the solidarity funds and things like that paid to players and things like that. But has there been anything to that effect on the tournament level to really look after these ATP 250 tournaments or the ITF events lower down, the Challenger circuit? How are they going to fare? Are we going to see any kind of mass exodus or kind of tournaments dropping off the calendar next year that just simply aren't able to be viable because they rely so heavily on bringing fans in? Are there meaningful mechanisms in place to help some of these stakeholders?
As things stand, the only tournaments that I'm aware that aren't going to take place are those in Australia where the location just isn't going to be viable because of the pandemic and because of the way the authorities are just so concerned, the wider government or authorities, and they want to move everything to Victoria so that it's all minimised in terms of travel. So tournaments like Brisbane and Auckland, I know, are not going to take place next year. But I think you're right to point out that the challenge goes beyond that because of the sheer economics. A lot of these tournaments can't survive on TV rights alone or sponsorship alone. They need those people through the doors. So I don't know whether it's going to have that knock-on effect of making them unviable for the year, but I think we will find out in the coming weeks. In terms of that sort of trickle down big events and authorities looking after those small events, I'm not sure. I've seen it with the players. With Wimbledon, for instance, produced a fund for the players to give all of them an amount of money from the money they're getting from the pandemic insurance, and they are adjusting prize money. I know the ATP and I think the WTA will as well. There'll be some adjustments in the prize money to enable these tournaments. That's probably the biggest thing, to enable these tournaments to function just on lower revenues and just to help them be viable, because so much of the money does go out and obviously into prize money. I mean, the players would say not enough, but I think that there is a realization amongst the players that they're at a crucial time right now, and this is not the time to be greedy in terms of they might want a bigger piece of the pie at the Grand Slams, and we've seen the attempt to set up a tennis players union in order to put some more pressure and represent the players' interests recently. But talking to Feliciano Lopez recently, who not only is still a player in his late 30s, he's also a tournament director in Madrid. He was really aware of both sides of the coin, that you can't just be asking for money from tournaments at a time like this, and everybody's got to cut their cloth accordingly. And I think that message is spreading. Most of the players that I hear from just want to be able to play and earn what they can, but there's an understanding that this is going to be a really difficult time for everybody for a long time.
Get the very best of SportsPro sent straight to your inbox. Head to sportspromedia.com and sign up for the SportsPro Daily. You'll get a roundup of all the biggest stories, features and opinion from our team every single morning. You'll find that all and much more at sportspromedia.com. SportsPro, connecting and inspiring the business world of sport.
I mean, it's come at an interesting point because, there have been these conversations going around anyway about who earns what from tournaments and about governance and about how much power players should be having, how much, what the balance needs to be between promoters' shares and players' shares, and how unified the sport of tennis needs to be in terms of how it's operated. Whether the early lockdown chatter was about some kind of unification move between the ATP and the WTA. What form exactly that would take, nobody ever really got past the thought experiment stage. But certainly, Mike, it's something that there's a bit of appetite for.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder, how much is kind of going on behind the scenes, really. Obviously, we had kind of public declarations of support from the likes of Billie Jean King and Roger Federer in those early days when that kind of talk of a merger arose. But yeah, I wonder whether the powers that be at the ATP and WTA and ITF and the Grand Slams have actually met and sat around a table and discussed how they can kind of align their interests and bring the sport closer together. I think the fragmented nature of the sport has been a hallmark of it since the beginning of time. And so, I think when something like a global pandemic happens, that is obviously going to cause tensions and those interests. I mean, we saw with the French Open, as David mentioned, the French Open was kind of lifting itself from its normal spot and then shifting itself to later in the year. That had a knock-on effect on the US Open, for example, and other tournaments. So, the areas like calendar, coordination, prize money, everything like that, I think is all of those issues are going to need to be addressed at some point. And yeah, it'd be interesting to know how much talk there has been behind the scenes. I wonder as well if the pandemic has kind of focused minds on some of those issues that were ongoing beforehand. Obviously, we've spoken about the distribution of prize money and tournament revenues and things like that. But obviously, here we are in a year where the ATP Cup launched back in January. Davis Cup had been kind of reformatted and revamped. We've also got Roger Federer's Laver Cup, which was cancelled for this year, I believe, in Boston. But you've got on the men's calendar alone, you've got 3 team events that everyone was saying at the time, when the ATP Cup did launch, can these coexist justifiably, financially viably? Whether there's been talk to bring the ATP Cup and the Davis Cup together in some way. I don't know if you have an inside word on that, David. And it'd be interesting to know in those discussions, who's really got the strongest hand to play in that kind of game in terms of protecting and preserving their own tournament and their own interests.
Yeah, I mean, if I think back a year ago, that was all the talk. I mean, it was Chris Commode a year before that, during his term as the ATP CEO, who said that having those 2 tournaments, the Davis Cup Finals and the ATP Cup, within 6 weeks of each other at the end of the year and the start of the year, he said that would be insane. And that's exactly what ended up happening. And that's just classic tennis of territoriality, just people having their territory and refusing to give any ground because they don't want to cede any, and even if it's for the greater good of the sport. And I mean, if something is to come from a situation like this, it's stopping everybody and perhaps making them have to think differently. I personally think it is ridiculous, even though there are 2 very good events on a certain level. It would make total sense to me to have one big team event and for it to become effectively a 5th Grand Slam. That's what I would like to see happen. But with, as you say, the Laver Cup coming in, and it's very successful, it's very effective, albeit over 4 days. I think it is a much more of an exhibition type feel event. But there is room for a team event, a big team event, but it's confusing to people. People don't understand why there was one after another like that. I think in terms of the potential for a merger, this is certainly something with Andrea Gaudenzi coming in. One of the big things he has pushed throughout is collaboration between the ATP and the WTA, certainly in terms of resources and the public and digital vision. They've done virtual TV shows, online TV shows together called Tennis United, although that seems to have stopped at the moment. But I feel that there is room for so much more. And now that the pandemic has come along, you have a sport, the strongest sport in the world in terms of being a women's sport as well as a men's sport. And there are celebrated global stars all the way through tennis and its history. And it's so much stronger when the 2 genders are playing the same tournaments and working together. And to me, that is absolutely the way it should be going in the future.
I mean, I spoke a few weeks ago to Andrea Gaudenzi, and I believe that piece is going live on the SportsPro site this week to coincide with the finals. There were a few things he said, around some of these areas. I mean, he wasn't all that committal on some of the detail, and he said that the detail is something, the devil is in the detail, and that's something that's going to come at a later stage. But he did mention there being a working group in operation with the WTA, with the Grand Slams, to try and encourage some greater coordination. He talked about having a bit of coherence to the calendar, but it was interesting that he said that he thinks the team event should be at the start of the year and the finals at the end, because of course the ATP Cup is at the start of the year. So make of that what you will. But the broad thrust of what he was saying is that the ATP has a two-step strategy that they're trying to enact, where they'll get their own house in order first and kind of align the interests of promoters and players, and maybe try and tighten up some of the mechanisms that they were already starting to put in place, and create a bit more certainty maybe for some players in terms of income, in terms of their experience at different tournaments and so on, and a bit more consistency in terms of the product from event to event. But his overarching message is that the opportunity for tennis is for a singular, product to take to the tennis fan, and that there's a bit of inefficiency in terms of where it makes its money, particularly on the digital and broadcast side. And they've lent on some research that suggests tennis is the world's fourth most popular sport, but it makes about 1.4% of global broadcast income in the sports market. That tennis makes about 50p or 50 cents per fan per year, compared to $3 for golf. So that there's a huge opportunity there, but it's going to come from, Mike, a little bit more of a kind of concentration and alignment of interests.
Yeah, I think Gaudenzi spoke about centralising data and media rights, didn't he? I think, the fragmented nature of the kind of media profile of the sport, I suppose, is certainly in the UK and elsewhere, is a byproduct of that fragmented nature of the sport itself. I think if you compare it to other sports like golf or cycling, there's certainly more confusion in tennis as to where you go as a fan to access content, to buy content, to watch certain tournaments. Here in the UK, you've got likes of Amazon and the BBC, Eurosport, ITV. Then you've got ATP and WTA's own OTT products and things like that. So I think a bit of consolidation on that front is certainly going to help that cause. And I think that is one area where the ATP and WTA have come closer together. And you've seen Amazon come into the sport, and obviously snaffle kind of rights to both properties, I believe, as well as the US Open. So there is some movement in that direction. But yeah, as you say, I think the ATP's focus is the ATP first and foremost, and likewise with WTA, and the same can be said for the other stakeholders. So until they get their own houses in order and satisfy their own memberships, I think they'll struggle to then move on to working out what's best for the greater good, so to speak.
Yeah.
So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that it plays out on the media side of things, and whether there will be consolidation.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up golf and cycling, because of course those are two sports where we've seen attempts to create these global unified media offerings through both of them through Discovery, through Golf TV, and its purchase of the Global Cycling Network. I mean, that was also something that Andrea talked a bit about, was that was quite an appealing model. Whether that comes through a deeper partnership with Amazon, as you hint at there, or whether there's an expansion and a bit of backing for something like Tennis TV or what have you, we don't know. He spoke. It's quite funny. They declined the offer to do this as a podcast, but he would have been great in a podcast setting, because he spoke very expansively about the challenges that music came through, and he has a background in fintech and in music tech before he was a professional player, but then his second career began with that. And he talked about how record companies had to all buy into the kind of Spotify and Apple Music project in order for that to work, and they had to set aside their differences in order to get that to work. But that you still had to think about broadcast strategies in the round, and not everybody is going to be going to this centralized product. And actually, people still buy CDs, and people will still watch linear television, and you still have to think about all the moving parts. But yeah, there's certainly something going on there, and quite where it ends up, we shall see. I mean, before we finish, guys, obviously central to tennis and the appeal of tennis is the players. We started by talking about the ATP and the fact that the ATP Finals has ridden the wave of this extraordinary generation of men's players. But I feel, Mike, and some of this is borne out in the detail of 50 Most Marketable, which we did a few weeks ago with Nielsen, that there's almost a bit of a shift in terms of who might be, who might have the power commercially over the next few years, and we might start to see this emerging cadre of women's players perhaps have greater prominence.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it feels like we've been speaking about this kind of shift for forever because the big three, the big four have kind of stuck around for so long and been so successful on the men's side of the game. And obviously you've had Serena dominating the women's side of the game, but with the emergence of the likes of Naomi Osaka and others in recent years, there is a sense that they're really fulfilling that role as the face of their sport, the face of the WTA now. They are draws, commercial draws. They're draws to bring fans into tournaments. They do hold that star power, and they're magnets for brands as well. I think we had Osaka as the most marketable athlete on the planet just in 2019, and you see the way that she's really matured and kind of is fulfilling that role, and the way she was speaking out on social justice issues and things like that around the BLM movement earlier this year at the US Open. I think she's imminently launching a new Nike apparel line, I believe, and just the way that sponsors have been drawn to her is I think she's the next in a long line of WTA stars. As David was saying, this is the number one sport for women professionally. They've had many stars over the years. But I think just away from the players, I know we haven't spoken too much about the women's game in particular, obviously because we're in the midst of the ATP Finals. But I'll be intrigued to see how the women's game fares heading into next year. Obviously, they have kind of gravitated towards Asia, perhaps certainly more so than the ATP has in recent years. That dates back many years, I believe. But the WTA Finals in Shenzhen this year have been completely cancelled. Their Asian swing has been decimated, so their kind of centre of power has been kind of ripped from them this year. And interested to see what impact that has on the women's side of the game in particular. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, David. I know we haven't spoken too much about it, but it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on which players are emerging and also the state of the WTA's business heading into 2021.
I think in terms of players, women's tennis is in an incredibly healthy state in terms of just the number of exciting young players coming through, all of whom I think, and this is key to me as a commentator and with our tennis podcast, is in terms of people caring. There are players coming through that people will care about, that will follow the results, that want to know how they're getting along. And Naomi Osaka, I think, is right at the head of that group, both in terms of her talent, the titles she's won, and the appeal that she has. She's fun, she's interesting, and as you said, she's found her voice now. She's found out who she is during this pandemic and during the period where there was no tennis and the social justice issues were right at the forefront of her mind. And she took a part in those and really became somebody that we didn't know before. And there are many players over the course even of the last 12 months, Iga Swiatek winning the French Open out of nowhere. And she's shown herself to be a really engaging young person with huge talent and can go and win a lot of titles, you imagine. Coco Gauff as well, the young teenager. So there's a lot of great stories. But you're right to say that tour has been decimated in its latter segment, and while men's tennis has gone from the French Open and Rome, it's then had an indoor season in Europe, and it's culminating here at the ATP Finals, this huge money spinner, all eyes on it. And women's tennis has literally had lints over the last 3 or 4 weeks in Ostrava in a period. It's almost like 12 tournaments on the men's side to 2 on the women's side, and it's because all of those events in Asia at a swoop were just cancelled because the authorities refused to let any events be played there. it's a huge money spinner for the WTA. And when times are going well and when they're all being played, it's a fantastic business model. But it's shown its vulnerabilities here. And I'm not saying that anybody could have foreseen something like this, but it showed that they had all their eggs in the one basket, really. And they have to have a plan B for next year, because I don't see how viable the tour can be if it goes through this again next year. I mean, the hope would be that things will be back to normal, or at least vastly improved if vaccines are implemented and the virus is not having the same impact, and all these tournaments in Asia can go ahead. But they have to have a plan B, I think, if that's not the case.
It'll be something to watch again as to whether that has an effect on some of the conversations about closer collaboration between the tours and between the various governing forces in tennis.
Yeah, I mean, wasn't it a shame that the ATP Finals wasn't able to just say, "Well, come to London then"? You know, it's only eight players and 8 doubles teams. Come and have your WTA event in conjunction with us at the O2. I've not managed to. I've been trying to get an interview with the head of the WTA, to Steve Simon, to find out about various decisions, and I don't know whether that was ever mooted, or I'd love to know, because that seems like a really good idea to me.
And certainly, I'd imagine that, yeah, that kind of greater flexibility and cooperation might be something, or the possibility of that might be something that exercises minds. But I guess, as we're kind of coming to the close here, and you're looking for reasons to be optimistic after what's been a pretty challenging year. And I guess for the women's game, it is that next generation of players. And again, referring back to the most marketable list and the research that Nielsen did, I mean, one of the things that they discovered, the list was based on primarily on kind of social media traction, and the two things that demonstrates are a slightly younger cohort of fans, and then also a feeling of greater proximity to those fans. And it was very interesting that it was women's tennis players who seem to be overperforming in that respect. And I guess, David and Mike, that's going to be something that kind of powers the sport through the next few years.
Yeah, I think this is a huge opportunity for women's tennis, with the inevitable fading of Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal from the scene. That will happen over the next few years, and eventually Novak Djokovic, Andy Murray, who have been just ever presents for 15 years. And obviously women's tennis has had Serena Williams and one or two others, but it's had a lot of winners and struggled at times to create rivalries that people can really latch onto. If you think of over the years, Chris Evert and Martina Navratilova played 70 or 80 times. That just they haven't even been having a dozen matches between one or two players at the top of the game. I think that could be about to change, and I think that the women's stars are going to start to be known by their first names over the next few years, because there's a handful. There's a lot of great talented players, but there's a few that have something special, and they potentially have a window here as well, without men's tennis getting all the attention.
Mike, what else would you point to for 2021 for as a cause for optimism for tennis?
Well, I'm not going to just say this because David is joining us today, but I think we should. David, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Of reflections on this year and where things stand on the tennis podcast heading into next year. I know it's gone from strength to strength certainly in recent years, especially this year. As a listener myself, I know you've had some successful kind of crowdfunding campaigns in recent years. You've got another one coming up. But yeah, obviously the impact of the pandemic, as we've been discussing, has been harsh for literally everyone in tennis. But I'd be interested to hear how you guys, the Tennis Podcast, kind of dealt with the initial blow, and how you've ultimately come out of it the other side stronger than ever.
Yeah, thank you for the kind words, first of all. But I mean, it has been a fascinating experience, because when we started the podcast 8.5 years ago, and for the first 4 years we made not a penny. We lost money. We didn't have any sponsors or any revenue streams at all. But we loved it. Catherine Whitaker, who presents the Amazon Prime Video coverage, is my co-host, and we just did it for the love of it, really. But I always had in mind that one day it could be a business, because there just were not any tennis podcasts in the world apart from ours. And so it was just about trying to build a sound and an audience that people might like. We began crowdfunding 3.5-4 years ago. So we've done 4 Kickstarters, and they've gone 16,000 in the first year. It made 28 the next, 53 the next, and then the most recent one last year it made 85. So it's had good increases, but the interesting thing has been how unreliable we've found the advertising market all the way through, and the sponsorship market. We've had some partners, but I've never felt like I really understand the sponsorship market for podcasts well enough to be able to trust it, which is why we've stuck with crowdfunding. And then when we came into the pandemic period, we'd already been crowdfunded for the whole year by our listeners by the end of January. And suddenly our weekly show throughout the year and our daily show during the Grand Slams that we promised wasn't going to be deliverable, because there was no tennis. So we had to very quickly adjust and work out what we could do. First thing we did is offer a refund to all 1,500 backers. We had one person take us up on it. And I think the reason that is partly goodwill, because we'd always delivered for them in the past and produced the shows that they wanted to hear. And secondly, we'd launched and come up with a concept of tennis relived, which is going and watching great stories and matches and tournaments of the past and creating podcasts about them. And we did 30 of those during when the French Open and Wimbledon would have been, one per day, about wonderful moments from the past. And people were absolutely lapping it up, who listened to us, and we were loving the process. But I feel like the audience just wanted a constant. They wanted, even though there was no tennis, they wanted to hear a tennis podcast, because they wanted those familiar voices in their ears who they usually have, and it was a comfort to a lot of people. We got a lot of emails about that exact point. So crowdfunding at the start of the year enabled us to see out the year, and we've actually produced more shows than ever before. I mean, we're going to be up to around about 150 by the end of this year. So who knows how well it'll go when we launch again on December the 1st to try to crowdfund 2021. But I mean, for me, it's quite uplifting and heartwarming the way just the listeners themselves forget business. I mean, I'm sure many of our listeners will have been hard hit as well by the economy and the effects of the pandemic. But the goodwill out there has been really uplifting, and seeing businesses like that and others like The Athletic going directly to the consumer and saying, here you go, we're going to produce something high quality for you. You pay for it, we'll produce it. And then it's just about being good to our word, and that's what we always try to be, and make them feel as though they're glad they signed up.
Well, David, I hope I hope that goes well, and I hope as well that you have a slightly more normal 2021 covering the sport of tennis, and there's a little bit more to discuss on the court. But yeah, I think we're going to wrap it up there. But thank you very much for joining us today, David Law.
It's been a pleasure. Lovely to talk to you both. And yeah, I enjoy the show, listening to it myself. It's a fascinating process to hear how all these sports and the businesses behind them operate. So yeah, I hope 2021 is a better one for you as well.
Yeah, that's very kind, David. And thanks as well to Michael Long.
Yeah, thanks, Eoin, and yeah, thanks to you, David. All the best for the upcoming fundraising campaign, and obviously next year as well, as Eoin said. But yeah, cheers, Eoin.
Thanks to all of you for listening. We're going to be back with you again very soon. Bye-bye.
The SportsPro Podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.